I moved to Silicon Valley in 2014 and I moved back to London in 2020. And a lot of interesting questions have come up over that time. But one that comes around and around is how does the European tech ecosystem compare to Silicon Valley? And how might that change? When do we start seeing huge European tech companies, huge European unicorns? And there's enough interesting questions around that, enough misconceptions and frameworks and numbers that it's worth spending a little bit of time just teasing apart some of what those questions might be. I think the first thing to think about is we are now going through what you might call the end of the American internet. That's to say the end of the time in which all the interesting stuff happened in America, which mostly means happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back at the beginning of the consumer internet in the mid-1990s, there were only about 100 million PCs on Earth, and half of those were in America, twice as many, more 3 times as many as in Europe. So it wasn't really very surprising that most of the interesting stuff was happening there. Today, that's clearly not the case. The smartphone is now the platform, and there are more smartphones in Europe than the USA. There are, meanwhile, more smartphones in China than Europe and the USA combined, and also more in India. And then twice as many again if you go to the rest of the world. There's about 4 to 4.5 billion smartphones on Earth today. And so that period in which all the users were in a relatively small number of relatively rich places, basically middle-class households and big corporations, that's over. This stuff has now gone global. And you see the same thing reflected in company creation, software creation, startup creation, and hence venture capital investment. Even back in the late 2000s, 3/4 or so of venture capital investing around the world was happening in the USA. Again, about half of that was in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, it's more like 50-50. So software has gone global. Startups have gone global. Technology has gone global. You don't have to be in the valley anymore. That, of course, gets you to the question, well, then what about Europe? This is, after all, a market with 450 million people, maybe 500 million people, $15 trillion of GDP. It's quite a big place. And there's a lot of people studying science, studying mathematics, studying engineering. There's also some great computer science departments. About half of the top global computer science departments are in Europe, just as many as there are in the USA. So you should have a pipeline of people who are ready and willing to create companies and to use the products that those companies create. Everyone in Europe has a smartphone, more than, in fact, in China, higher percentage than in China. And Europe does, in fact, have a word for entrepreneur. There's a bunch of ways that you can argue about the statistics, but the idea that people don't create companies in Europe certainly isn't correct. Indeed, if one looks at the number of companies raising seed rounds last year, again, there was a relatively comparable number of companies to the figure in the USA. So this gets you to the question, well, what's the problem? Where have we come from, and how might that be changing? First observation, if you look at the top 100 public companies by market cap, only 2 of those are European tech companies, as opposed to a higher proportion of those being tech companies from the rest of the world. And those 2 companies, incidentally, aren't what you might call modern software companies. They're not consumer companies. They're not platform companies. SAP and ASML are both very important and interesting, but they're not kind of part of everybody's daily life in the way that Google or Amazon or Snapchat or Twitter might become. Meanwhile, so let's talk about what's going on here. Well, we said we've got a market of 450 million people and $15 trillion of GDP, but that's not really one market. And this isn't a political point, it's a business point. You can launch a company, launch a product, and deploy across the USA, or in some ways deploy across China, much more easily than you can launch a product and deploy it across the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Indeed, if you were looking at some kind of consumer business, particularly any kind of a local business, that fragmentation becomes more significant because the USA is not just a big market, it also comes in lots of easily digestible chunks. So you can do New York and then LA and then Miami and Chicago and Austin. And so you can go and roll out market by market by market and get to 100, 200 million people. There are more people in New York and LA than there are in the top 10 markets combined of any European country. And so that makes it much easier for a whole class of business to scale out across the USA than to scale out across Europe. You can launch in San Francisco and then you can launch in Austin. You can't launch in London and then launch in Marseille, Milan and Barcelona. Meanwhile, of course, if one's thinking about scale, there is a China conversation here. China has 5 city clusters with a total of over 100 million people. The Yangtze River Delta has 150 million people, which is something between a city and a country on this kind of a scale. And of course, that changes the kind of businesses that you can create. Meanwhile, the USA is both more concentrated and more homogeneous. Technology is much more concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area than anywhere in Europe. London, Cambridge, Oxford combined are about 30% of early stage funding in Europe. You can argue a bit about this. The San Francisco Bay Area is more like 45% of US early stage. It's also much easier to move to San Francisco from across the USA. Only about 0.2% of the population of the EU moved country in 2017, 10 times that many moved state in America. And you can over-index that number because obviously the people that you actually want to hire, the people who are going to build a company and going to write code for you, are more likely to be able to speak English and more likely to be able to relocate. But again, as you try and scale your business across the continent, you can send a team from Chicago to Miami to New York to Austin, and they do at least speak the same language, and that's going to be quite a lot more difficult going across Europe because, again, as the third stat here gives you, only about 16% of the EU population is proficient in any foreign language, even less if you were to subtract the UK from that. So there is a kind of a spread of interesting challenges here. In the UK, e-commerce penetration is significantly ahead of the USA. It was already ahead at the beginning of 2020 before we went into lockdown. Then, of course, lockdown accelerated e-commerce, and the UK had a much bigger lockdown than the USA. So it jumped from about 20% of retail revenue to close to 30% as we're now stabilising or not as we come into 2021. So the UK is ahead, and the UK is actually ahead on a lot of different metrics, but that's not anything like the same in the rest of Europe. So only about 38% of Italians made any online purchase in 2019. Romania, where there have been some great engineering companies created, actually has even lower penetration. And so that adoption of this stuff is ahead in the UK. It's actually not ahead in the rest of Europe. This is a sample of some of the bigger markets. You can get a sense of that spread with this map, which is kind of an interesting echo of those analyses that people sometimes do, splitting up Europe by people who cook with butter versus olive oil, or people who get drunk on stuff that comes from grapes versus grain. There's a really wide spread of adoption across Europe. You have the same. So, and if you think about those segments, as I've said, the UK is well ahead of the USA. There's a bunch of small northern markets that are also leading. So, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and so on. Germany is a very mixed picture. It's ahead in subsegments and well behind in others. And then southern European markets like Spain, France, and Italy are quite a long way behind, 3 to 5 years behind in adoption on most of these kind of metrics. That gets reflected in e-commerce, where European e-commerce revenue is significantly behind the USA. Even more dramatically in advertising, UK online advertising is bigger than France and Germany combined. And so if you want to build any kind of consumer product, you're either going to be selling online or you're going to be doing advertising online, and possibly both. And Europe is a way harder market to do that than the USA. On pretty much any measure, Europeans are online less. So again, this gives you a spread from small Nordics. So Estonia has significantly higher time spent online than the UK. The UK is ahead of the USA, but then Germany, Spain, France are at half the level of the UK, and Italy is at half is half again smaller. So you have this low consumer adoption. You also have low enterprise adoption. This is a metric from Eurostat on enterprises using cloud computing from 2018. Again, you see this spread between the UK and small Nordics, small northern versus southern Europe. So Spain, Italy, France have dramatically low adoption of the kind of modern generation of software to the USA or to the UK or to Northern Europe. And so all of these kind of this spread in adoption and this spread in the ease of creating a very big multinational business, that is reflected in funding. So in the last 9 years, from 2010 to 2019, there was almost double the early stage startup investment in California than in all of Europe combined. So less than $50 billion in Europe, $75 billion just in California. So if you kind of pull those threads together, what do we mean when we say tech in Europe? Well, Europe isn't a market. And that, again, is not a political point. It's an observation about what it takes to build a business. Europe is not a market in the sense that the USA is a market or that China is a market. Digital adoption varies a great deal. Some parts of Europe are well ahead of the USA. Very large European countries are quite a long way behind the USA. And a startup ecosystem, consequently, is still only emerging. And the next thing to talk about, therefore, is how much all of that is changing. How much is the ecosystem changing? How much is funding changing? How much is company creation changing? So the first observation is a narrative violation. Having said, well, there's not that much stuff happening in Europe, actually that's changed pretty dramatically in the last 10 years. Really, even in the last 5 years since I moved to Silicon Valley at the beginning of 2014. And at that point, there were less than 20, what we call unicorns, so companies worth more than $1 billion. There were less than 20 in 2014. There's now over 120. And you can argue quite a lot about quite what the definitions and the dates are on this. Some people will know I'm not a huge fan of cumulative charts, but this is a way of giving you a sense of how that relative scale of creation has changed. It's also interesting to look at how this is distributed across Europe. So the UK is twice as large on this scale as Germany. France is really significantly underweight. And then Netherlands, Sweden, and quote-unquote other are each dominated by one really big win, very obviously in Sweden, that's Spotify. But if you look at the market overall, you do have those kind of lightning strikes of the huge, amazing company created somewhere fairly small. But you also have real breadth in the number of companies and the scale of companies that are getting created. You see something similar at the other end of the scale in the pipeline, with a real surge in enthusiasm or awareness or consciousness of the possibility of creating a startup. And I think it's very interesting to look at the startup evangelism events. So things like Slush, things like Web Summit 4 years from now that happens would be happening in Barcelona in a month or two, which are really about communicating the idea that a startup is possible. And that's not something you need to do in Silicon Valley because everybody thinks about that and talks about that every day. In Europe, it's actually there's real meaningful value in creating the idea of this and spreading consciousness of what that would mean. And so you see, as the slide says, tens of thousands of people coming to these things to try and understand what this might mean. You even have some take-up in Italian e-commerce, startling as it is to see, particularly accelerating in lockdown, but even some steady growth happening before that. And so if one thinks about the phrase I used, the startup ecosystem, it's important to understand that this is a system and a machine. Silicon Valley is a machine for creating startups, and a startup is an experiment. And you need lots of different things around that machine, around that cluster, just as you do around an arts cluster or a banking cluster or a movie cluster. You need attitude and you need all sorts of different components to that ecosystem. And so this slide, which I won't read out, gives you a sense of what some of those components are. Silicon Valley, by really historical accident, evolution, and accumulation, has sort of accumulated all of those. Europe is building up many of those in separate places, in separate ways, and it probably doesn't quite have all of this. But it's a lot further down the road of building things like support networks, tax and visa systems that don't block people from creating startups, and again, a consciousness of how this would work and how you might do it and how you might support it. All of that gets you, therefore, to early stage funding in Europe increasing by about 4 times since 2010, from under $250 million to close to $10 billion in 2019. That is actually getting into striking distance of California. Now, obviously one can argue a little bit about what's in these numbers and what's underrepresented, but clearly we've gone from a situation in which Europe had probably less than half of the early stage funding of California, which again means Silicon Valley, to now, 3/4, 75%, 85%, 65%, whatever it is, the gap has closed pretty significantly. Now, of course, there's lots more funding in the USA, but that does give you a sense of how the relative picture has changed. So we have this change in weight and this change in awareness. The other strand that quite often comes up here is how much does Europe have some kind of advantage, some kind of leverage? Where can Europe punch above its weight? What are these special things that Europe can do or that Europe can understand? And it's an interesting topic. I'm going to talk about it, frankly, in partly to kind of try to take it apart and suggest that might not be the right place to look. And so if we talk about European leverage, there have been 3 things that historically have been top of mind for looking at European tech. Fields where Europe has some kind of specific advantage that people talk about a lot. And that's frontier science, so new cutting edge science coming out of labs that can be turned into things. It's fintech, where Europe has the advantage of much more modern financial infrastructure, much more modern, much more flexible regulation than the USA, and a global cluster in the City of London that's comparable to the global cluster that the USA has in New York, which of course is not in San Francisco. And then thirdly, in biotech. So there are these huge pools of data, there are these national healthcare systems, there is a sense of sort of somewhat functional healthcare systems that can actually do things, whereas the USA doesn't really have a healthcare system. And linking to the point about frontier science, there's very often an argument that Europe has huge amounts of underexploited research, that the ratio of research to kind of patents and company creation is much lower. So there's this huge pool of stuff that could be happening in bio. Now, there's quite a lot to support this. So if you look at European research production, and particularly research that's highly cited, so not just stuff that gets churned out by a machine, but stuff that actually has value and that gets cited, Europe, in fact, produces more highly cited research, at least on some metrics, than the USA, and certainly significant. Both the USA and Europe are still producing significantly more than China. Meanwhile, if one looks at the term of the moment, AI, America is a global magnet for AI talent, so people move to America from China and from India. Europe creates as much AI talent as the USA and keeps it. So this is a real glass half full, glass half empty slide, because we don't have a problem of European AI scientists all going to America. On balance, we get as many as we lose. On the other hand, we don't have the advantage of being a global magnet for researchers from other places in the way that the USA does. Meanwhile, there is an interesting story here about regulation, and regulation does tend to be an expletive, an obscenity in the USA and in some parts of the tech industry. But there's an interesting conversation around how actually the kind of functionality and the capabilities of European regulatory structures are actually better for startup creation than the USA, mainly because it's actually easier to change things. The USA has regulated industries where the regulations have been set, and it then becomes extremely difficult to change that regulation if something new happens. Very difficult for it to take into account of drones or computational biology or blockchain. Relatively much easier, just from an institutional structure and process point of view, to adjust European regulation to take scope of new things that might be happening. There's also a phenomenon that people sometimes talk about, that you have these dozen different economies that operate in different ways, and that actually means you get much more experimentation with trying to solve specific problems. Now, again, this can be good and bad, because sometimes people get stuck into solving some issue that only exists in Germany and will never exist anywhere else, or they get stuck in trying to solve conveyancing in the UK, which isn't going to help anybody else. But it also means that you have this kind of tension and this flexibility that means that where you're in a regulated industry, European regulation can sometimes work better for you than US regulation. So that's the setup. Europe is going to lead in frontier science, fintech and bio. Well, yeah, except that if you actually look at where the unicorns are, we have another narrative violation. So less than 20% of European unicorns, that 120 number by valuation, is actually in fintech and bio. Now, bio number looks a little small here because you have a longer lead time. But I think the key point here is there's actually an awful lot of those unicorns are not in those sectors. People are creating unicorns in a much more kind of broadly spread sense. That is then reflected in where the early stage investment is in the last 5 years. So there's investment in fintech and there's growing investment in bio, but actually the majority of the early stage investment in Europe is happening on a much broader basis. And you can see that at the top line if you look at distribution of those unicorns by enterprise versus consumer. So it used to be the case that Europe every now and then produced an interesting consumer company, so Spotify, for example. Now that's much more broadly spread. You have many more people creating interesting enterprise software companies, creating plumbing, breaking out of that sort of early special pleading and going into a sort of a generalized sense of software creation. And I think what this really illustrates, and this is a much more general sort of global point, is that software is eating the world, as my old colleague Mark Andreessen liked to say. And he said that, 7-8 years ago, but it's been happening ever since. And if one thinks back over the last kind of multi-decade timescale of the computing industry, maybe since the 1960s or 70s, we've gone through these generational changes. In the 60s and 70s, computing was about mainframes and big companies. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was about PCs and giving every company lots of computers. Then the web came along, and that meant that global middle classes acquired a computer. And then from 2007 to 2010 onwards, smartphones became the center of the tech industry, and that took computing to everybody on Earth. There's about 5.5 billion adults on Earth. Probably 4 to 4.5 billion people have a smartphone now. And so the next step after that is that computing, software, technology becomes a systemically important part of society. That's something that we see in politics and in public policy, but it's also something we see in company creation. And so I think one of my favorite kind of companies to talk about at the moment as an illustration of some of the trends that we're seeing is Shopify, which has come from nowhere, well, if you count Canada as nowhere, to do over $80 billion of GMV in the first 3 quarters of 2020, probably do well over 100, maybe 110, $120 billion of GMV in 2020, partly as a result of lockdown, but mostly as a result of a systemic shift towards buying things online, a systemic shift towards much more generalized company creation, much more generalized digital adoption. And I think the way that I talk about companies like Shopify and also Google and Apple and Facebook and Amazon and Stripe and a whole bunch of other people that most people have never heard of is that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We have a scale of consumer adoption and a scale of consumer expectation, and those are quite different things, that make entirely new kinds of business possible. And we also have platforms that make it vastly easier to create or experiment or build a company without needing the kind of capital and the kind of resource that you would have needed in the past. And so we're in a moment now where we have an explosion of company creation and an explosion of consumer adoption. And then it's useful to map that against a sense of what the opportunity might be. And we spend an awful lot of time talking about e-commerce and advertising and maybe social. But let's just get a sense of what e-commerce was last year relative to global retail, which is $20 to $25 trillion, and relative to global consumer spending, which is something over $40 trillion. The opportunity here is not brown cardboard boxes instead of going to the supermarket. The opportunity is to think about every aspect of the human experience and how that might be addressed by software. A good way of thinking about this, I find, is to look at the first 20, 25 years of the consumer internet as being fundamentally about data arbitrage. It was about providing information around the edge of a business, around the edge of an industry. So if you were looking at housing, you would be building listings and you'd be doing mortgage comparisons. If you were trying to do something in transport, you'd be selling tickets, or you'd again be doing price comparisons. Food, entertainment, well, you do mail order books, you do restaurant reviews. Now you create companies that actually change what those businesses are. Airbnb isn't a hotel booking engine. Uber is not a taxi booking service. We have companies that are changing what a mortgage is, companies that are changing what TV is, companies are unbundling restaurants into food delivery, and of course, DeepMind, changing how we think about discovering cures for sort of profound biological questions with things like AlphaFold. And the transition that we're going through, I think, and there's a sort of a great praise from the past, is that the first 50 years of the car industry were about creating car companies and working out what cars should be. 4 wheels, 1 steering wheel, a roof, electric windows. And the second 50 years of the car industry were about everything that happened once everybody had a car. So McDonald's, Walmart, suburbs, freeways, and all the bad things that came with that as well. And we're spending time thinking about the bad things that come with software now. But it's not about creating cars anymore. It's what happens when everyone has a car. And I think a lot of the interesting questions in technology now are about not how do we get everyone a computer, but what happens when everyone has a computer and is willing to do everything with it. That's to say we've gone through a progression from software and computing and technology being a giant box in a giant company that does payroll, to Tinder, to software being part of everybody's life and the future of everybody's life. So if I pull these threads together and think about where we are now, I want to make one very micro point, which is to think about Silicon Valley, and particularly Silicon Valley in lockdown. And so what this chart is showing you is relative house price performance in San Francisco versus New York. And we think of New York as being an expensive place, but San Francisco house prices have almost doubled relative to New York in less than a decade. And so there's a boiling the frog moment. Does the lockdown and remote work and nobody being able to go into the office mean that people finally say, actually, I don't need to be there? There's always been this joke in Silicon Valley that I'm hiring people to create a global, borderless, seamless communication system that will make distance meaningless. Must be willing to relocate to San Francisco. Well, now we're testing that question and seeing, well, what does it actually mean? Do you have to be in San Francisco? How global can you be? How many more places can you create software? And I think what captures that best, and this is a callback to the point I made at the beginning of this presentation, is to think about what the addressable market used to be and what it is now. Back in 1995, there were 100 million PCs on Earth. Half of them were in North America, another quarter were in Western Europe. 3/4 of those PCs were in big companies. So there were maybe 25 million PCs on Earth. Today, there's 4 to 4.5 billion smartphones on Earth. But actually, that's not the addressable market either. The addressable market is to think about the global middle class and all of those billions of people and where those people are. And so I've used the phrase global diffusion. I've asked about Europe. I used the phrase the end of the American internet. Really, I think what's happening here is that software and startup creation go global. That Europe is building a flywheel. That means Europe will be one part of that, along with many other parts. But rather more fundamentally, that everyone will do anything online. And with that, thank you.